There goes a fly ball towards left field. Going back fast is Kennedy. Kennedy gets there, and he takes it. And the Cleveland Indians are the world champions of 1948. And
this is Cleveland's Team, a baseball history podcast. A regular look back at professional baseball in Cleveland from 1901 and beyond. Now, here's your host, Guardians team historian, Jeremy Fedor.
Yeah, we're just going to do a kind of a quick interview about, quick, we'll talk about it and get everything you have to say. But so I went back and looked up the date of the game, obviously was September 12th, 1974. And for you, that was probably just a regular game to go to with some friends?
Exactly. It was, back then it was kind of, hey, it's late in the year. The Indians by that time had a very entertaining year. Somebody had pitched a no-hitter. Of course, we had beer night. They got off to a good start. Gaylord Perry was having a real good year, but by September they had pretty much faded. And plenty of good seats were available, as they say. The bleacher seats were super cheap. And I remember those kind of games in Cleveland. Maybe that night was an unusually nice night, but they all tended to drift together in kind of a misty, maybe not so outstanding night weather-wise. But and it was a very normal game. We went the bleachers, and I remember I was probably about the second person from the gate, or right at the gate, and a guy tapped me on the shoulder, as I remember, and I'm going, geez, did they? I didn't know what they had tagged me for. The first thing was, hey, I'm just here, and he says, no, you're. You will go through the ticket gate, and we want to talk to you. And I'm going, well, let's talk to me now. I think they wanted to make sure I was actually going to pay to make myself a fan. He says, believe it or not, you're the 100,000th bleacher fan at Cleveland Stadium. And I said, wow, okay. And I knew, and attendance was up that year. I mean, attendance had been down, but it had been up mainly because they had a fairly decent year. I knew that. I mean, they drew 1 million people, which for the Indians back then, drawing 1 million people was like drawing 3 million today, I would say. And he said, okay. I said, that's good. He says, we have something for you, and would like you to make some plans to come on the field. And I'm going, whoa, this is way beyond. So my buddy and I, and they said, forget those seats. We got seats down behind the dugout. And we said, wow, okay. We were just poor college kids. We very rarely sat in box seats. So I remember couple people I met that night. One was John Adams, and I believe that was his second year of doing the drum. It just kind of become in fashion, and shook hands, and he went out with me to the field. There was this drum on the pitcher's mound, if you can picture that. And Gaylord Perry was there, and I can't remember if he was pitching that night or he was just there. And wow, man! But he was in uniform and stuff. He shook my hand and said, they introduced me 100,000 bleacher fan, and we had a short conversation. And then I went back in to the seat, and they said, we'll hold the drum for you till after the game. And I'm already thinking to myself, man, I had one of those little 1970s style compact cars. I said, I don't get this in the car, but we'll figure that out after the game. And I remember, there was a point during the game, John sat with us for a little while, and then he went up to the bleachers and was doing his thing while we watched the game. And I can't remember, after we had our recent thing with the drum, I was going back in my mind. It seems to me at some point in the game, we went up to the bleachers where he was at just to sit with him a little bit, because he was a really nice guy, very young guy at the time, like we all were, probably a couple of years older than me. And that was basically it. Somehow we got the drum that night, and we stuffed it in the car, took it back to Akron, drove by my parents. I said, hey, they said, what happened? And my dad had listened, I think, to part of the game, but he didn't pick up that I had won anything. And I said, just how it happened. So they kept the drum at their house for a couple of years, and it was nice cocktail hour conversation for them. While I was in a dorm like thing right then and didn't really I have a spot for it. There it stayed for a couple of years, and I moved up to Michigan in '76. And the drum followed me shortly thereafter, which was kind of neat because I had my own apartment, and it was kind of a thing. We tucked it in the corner and put a couple pieces of Indians memorabilia on it. It was a kind of a memory of Ohio for somebody living in Michigan. And then fortunately, in my 50 years of possession of the drum, probably the chances of it getting the most damaged were in the first 5 or 6 years, because we took it out to softball games, and a couple guys got the drum, and we beat the drum. And I remember one time we took it to the bar, which I'm thinking now, really not a really good idea. But when you're in your 20s, stuff happens, and it got through without a problem. Bought a house, went into the basement. Came out for special occasions. I always brought it out for when finally the Indians got competitive again in the '90s, and had it upstairs for the World Series games and stuff like that. Unfortunately, we couldn't quite bring it up. So, and the kids were somewhat interested in it, although I told them, I said, guys, if you're rumbling around as teenagers, I kind of like to keep this thing off to the side. And of course, eventually the kids moved away, and earlier this year, my wife's asking me, she said, as we often do when we get to this age, I'm 71, and we said, well, what if something happens to you, where do we do with the drum? And I said, yeah, I'm not going to put it out on the curb. I said, I think it's got some interest. That's when she said, do you think they'd want it back, or somebody in, oh, I said, I don't know. So that's when I contacted Fan Services, and I said, I just want somebody who's going to enjoy the drum. My sons are both baseball fans, but they live in other parts of the country now. My grandson wants to grow up to be a Colorado Rockies fan, which I can't figure or fathom in my mind, but so be it. Anyways, that's obviously they referred me to you. We started doing a discussion. I couldn't be more pleased that I found a home for it. And it will be taken care of in some form. So that's kind of the story of it. It's just an odd night in September of '74, which doesn't seem that long ago, but boy, we're at the 50-year mark here. So,
and
I'm
looking at the newspaper article, and it said you received 2 box seat tickets to remaining home games. So
I did.
Did you go to all of them, or?
I did. I went to most of them. A couple I gave. I think if I couldn't go to them, I gave them to some friends. I mean, by that time we were at September 12th. I think they had a couple more home series left. Again, the games by that time, they weren't part of a pennant race or anything. But I remember going there, and I remember the one game I remember going to in the box seats was the last game of the season, because it was pretty apparent then that they were going to be making some big changes. I mean, they had traded for Frank Robinson. In fact, I think they traded for Frank Robinson the week I won the drum. And it was pretty obvious that if they had not, I think their manager was Aspromani that year. If they hadn't formally relieved him, he was kind of like dead man walking. And I remember he changed pitchers on the last day of the season, and we were like the 8th or 9th inning, and they were about, I don't know, 10,000 people rattling around the big stadium there. And you kind of saw him going to the dugout, and I said, man, this is probably the last time I'm going to see this guy. And yeah, next year Frank came on, and it was a whole different vibe.
Yeah, and then that game you were at was a 3-2 Boston win. Boston scored in the 8th for one. You mentioned John, and for someone that was at a game in that era, like John was already then becoming a big deal. Like fans recognized him as a super fan with the drum, and so that's again hardly like a full year after he started drumming too. So that's pretty remarkable that was already a staple of baseball in Cleveland.
Yeah, and as the years went on, the games would be on from Detroit when the Tigers were in town, and the kids would always go, "Who's beating that drum?" So I said, I met that guy. And I keep telling him. And then I tied it back to the drum that was sitting in our basement. I said, yeah, how about that? So it was always kind of neat for them. And especially I took them down. They were just little guys. I remember going down to the stadium the last year it was open. I think it was 93. I said, hey, we got to go down to a game one more time. And it was pretty cool. John was beating the drum in the bleachers, and I totally get, yes, this is where it all happened, guys. And it was neat. Each year, as they got older and stuff, it was sort of a different perspective on that night and the drum and all that. So it was really cool.
Do you remember multiple drummers or just John?
I honestly just remember John. Now, maybe there were the first couple of years, but I just remember John doing his thing. But that doesn't mean there weren't. I can't quite remember how that started. I mean, he was the man by the time I won the drum in September of '74. But it's possible they started out with a couple different ones.
Yeah, and it's just, again, you mentioned it was John's second year, so the fact that the drum already represented the bleachers, I think is such a testament to
it took off very rapidly, and kind of funny because you would have thought somebody would have, the Indians and Chief Wahoo and stuff had a long history going back to the I mean 20s, 30s, 40s, whenever I know the team went by some different names very early in its history. So I kind of would have thought somebody might have done that earlier, but he was what it was. So it was pretty cool.
Well, I think
It's certainly for out of town fans. I had a lot of people tell me, they said that's the one thing when we see games from Cleveland, it's that guy beating that drum, because no fan in other cities. I mean, I'd go to Tiger Stadium here in Detroit and later, obviously, Comerica Park. There was no fan that was doing something that nothing. There was no equivalent to it, which was really kind of.
It ties back too to how you mentioned that they drew over a million fans, because that same article in the paper, it mentions that the 1,000,000th, 100,000th fan should come through the turnstiles when the Tribe returns home on September 23rd for a doubleheader against the Brewers. And that being a big deal, because John said he drummed, I believe, because he just wanted to make noise in that cave. I mean, there wasn't enough people there to make noise in that ballpark, so kind of came full circle that next year, drawing 1 million fans. So that's pretty pretty neat to put these pieces together of this puzzle. I mean, not puzzle, but just the history and the story, because those '70s years kind of get overlooked, because, like you said, you're kind of out of it by September.
Well, yeah, when I first started going to the games with my dad, I mean, we'd go in 65, 64, 65. And the weekend crowds in Cleveland weren't bad. I mean, we'd go there and there'd be 20 or 25,000. When things really tailed off, though, they weren't. If you went to a weekday or weeknight game, that's when unless it was early in the year and they were making some moves pennant wise, but most years by July everybody was kind of saying, "Hey, when do the Browns kick off?" That's when the attendance was really rough, and it was a big stadium. A crowd of 10,000 just got lost. But I mean, you compare that to the energy on when I went that Friday to the Guardians game, and I'm going there. There's no comparison. I mean, it's granted it's been a long period of time, but yeah, that's when the attendance. But that Monday to Thursday was just it was just really empty there for sure.
And I guess my kind of final question about all this is, who was your favorite player in those eras? What was it, like for you being a Cleveland fan in that era and going to that ballpark? And just any more thoughts on growing up that way as a Cleveland fan?
Oh, I think one of my favorite fans. I mean, when I first started following the Indians and Infamous, it had to be Rocky Colamito. I mean, my dad was a lifelong Indians fan too, and he was an Italian American, and Galavito was an Italian American. So I think that was part of it. But my dad just ate bullets of the fact that Galavito was such such a star in the, I want to say, mid 50s and late 50s, and then he got traded in 59 or 60 for Harvey Keenan, and then came to Detroit, and actually was a respected player here in Detroit. But I talked to folks my age who were Tigers fans back then, and they said the problem was the player here was Al Kaline. Everybody just loved Kaline, Hall of Famer. Colavito could never be in Detroit what he was in Cleveland. And then it turned out then, just as I was starting to follow the Indians got him back, and he had about 3 good years left. I think he got 100 RBIs or something a couple of years, but I mean, it was he was definitely the guy. And Sam McDowell, I remember McDowell. He was kind of a quirky guy, but I always thought he was a really good pitcher from a strikeout standpoint. I mean, when he was going, he was really going. And later on, of course, during the college years, it was great to have Gaylord Perry in here for a couple of years, a Hall of Famer with experience and still something left in the tank. And and back in those days, it was rare to trade for somebody who still had, more than 1 year left. So, but I've got to say, Colavito in the 60s for somebody my age was probably the number one guy. I always remember how he kind of stood in the back and he put his bat and do the back thing. He had a very unique stance when he came to the plate, and a great fielder too. So
awesome. Well, I'll probably end up cutting it there then, and that's what I wanted. That summary of.
You've been listening to Cleveland's Team, a baseball history podcast with Guardians team historian Jeremy Fedor.